I should have listened to the warnings. The locals at the gas station weren't just being superstitious when they told me to avoid Black Mesa during winter nights. As a freelance photographer, I've heard my share of local legends and cautionary tales, but something about their earnest faces should have given me pause. Instead, I smiled politely, filled up my brand new Airstream Classics tank, and drove straight into what would become the most terrifying experience of my life. The winter sun was already setting when I found the perfect spot to park. Right beneath one of Black Mesa's iconic cliffs, the location was ideal for my astrophotography project. Clear skies, minimal light pollution, and the stark beauty of Oklahoma's highest point looming above me. I spent the first few hours setting up my equipment, checking my solar panels, and preparing for what I hoped would be a productive week of shooting the winter sky. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, but my Airstream kept me comfortable as I reviewed my first set of test shots on my laptop. The stars were incredible out here, more vibrant than I'd seen anywhere else in the continental U.S. The Milky Way stretched across my low-D screen like a river of light, with the dark silhouette of Black Mesa cutting a jagged line through the cosmic display. That's when I noticed something odd in one of the frames. At first, I thought it was just sensor noise or maybe a satellite trail. But when I zoomed in, the strange light pattern seemed to form a distinct shape. It looked almost like a handprint, but that was impossible. The camera had been pointing straight up at the sky when I took the shot. A sudden gust of wind rocked my ARV, and I heard something that sounded like scratching along the aluminum exterior. I told myself it was just a branch or maybe some sand being blown against the side. But when I checked my weather app, there was no wind warning for the area. In fact, according to the forecast, it was supposed to be an unusually still night. The scratching came again, more deliberate this time, moving from the back of the RV toward my door, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A sound that shouldn't be possible out here in the desert. It was the distinct sound of wet footsteps slapping slowly against the frozen ground. Circling my Airstream, the footsteps continued their slow circuit around my ARV, and I sat frozen in my small dinette, barely breathing. My phone showed no service, not unusual for this remote location, but now the lack of connection felt suffocating. The Airstream's solar-powered system had been working perfectly all evening, but suddenly the lights began to flicker, and my laptop screen dimmed before shutting down completely. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, hands shaking as I pulled it from the kitchen drawer. The beam cut through the darkness inside the RV, but when I aimed it at the window, the light seemed to stop short. As if something thick and dark was pressing against the glass, the temperature inside the Airstream plummeted, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the flashlight's beam. The scratching had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. It reminded me of the deep drone of power line, but there weren't any utilities out here. This was the absolute middle of nowhere, which had been the whole point of my trip. The hum grew louder, and I felt it vibrating through the RV's floor and into my bones. My camera equipment was still set up outside, thousands of dollars worth of gear that I couldn't afford to lose. But as I watched dark shapes slide across my windows, I knew there was no way I was going to open that door. The shapes weren't cast by anything I could see. They moved like liquid shadows, flowing against the natural direction of the scarce moonlight. The hum suddenly changed pitch, rising to a frequency that made my teeth ache. My flashlight beam began to strobe, and in the stuttering light, I saw something through the window that defied explanation. A pattern of lights hovered above the mesa, forming a geometric shape that seemed to bend in impossible ways, as if it existed in more dimensions than my mind could process. Then my flashlight died, and in the perfect darkness, I heard my RV's door lock click open. The door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, letting in a blast of freezing air that smelled like ozone and wet stone. I scrambled backward toward my bedroom area, wedging myself into the corner as far from the door as possible. In the doorway, silhouetted against the starlit sky, stood a figure that seemed to be made of the same liquid shadows I'd seen on my window. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The figure was roughly humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long and jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. It didn't so much step as flow into my arm, moving with a fluid grace that made my stomach lurch. The temperature dropped even further, and ice crystals began forming on my windows. The creature brought with it that same deep hum I'd heard earlier, but now I realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a language. The vibrations formed patterns in my mind, creating images and sensations that felt ancient and utterly alien. I saw Black Mesa as it had been millions of years ago, when the rock was still young, and the stars were arranged in unfamiliar pattern. My phone suddenly came back to life, but instead of showing my home screen, it displayed a rapid sequence of symbols that looked like cave paintings but moved and shifted like living things. The symbols matched the patterns of light I'd seen above the mesa, and with growing horror, I understood that something was trying to communicate with me. The shadow figure reached out with what might have been an arm, and where it touched my Arv's wall, the aluminum began to ripple like water. The metal's surface became reflective in a way that aluminum shouldn't be, and in its warped surface I saw things moving, shapes and forms that my brain refused to fully process, glimpses of places that couldn't exist on Earth. And then the figure spoke, not in words, but in images that bloomed directly in my mind, showing me why the locals feared Black Mesa after dark, and why some visitors to this place never returned to tell their stories. The visions bombarded my mind. Ancient ceremonies performed beneath the mesa, doorways opened to places beyond our reality, and creatures that had been waiting in the rock since before humans walked the earth. Each image brought with it a physical sensation, the taste of metal, the smell of deep cave, the feeling of time itself bending around me like a river changing course. My airstream had become a prison of impossible physics. The interior spaces stretched and contracted, corners folded into themselves, and the walls rippled with patterns that matched the rhythm of that alien humming. My camera equipment outside began triggering automatically, the shutters clicking rapidly as if trying to capture something my human eyes couldn't perceive. The shadow being moved closer, its form constantly shifting between states of matter. I had no words to describe where it touched things. Reality seemed to thin, becoming transparent enough to see the layers of existence that normally remained hidden. Through these tears in the world, I caught glimpses of vast structures beneath the mesa, geometric patterns that hurt my eyes and made my nose bleed when I tried to focus on them. I realized with growing dread that I wasn't just being shown these things, I was being invited to join them. The creature's presence in my mind made it clear that this was some kind of recruitment or transformation. The people who had vanished here hadn't all died. Some had gone somewhere else, become something else. The thought made me feel simultaneously terrified and horrifyingly curious. A high-pitched tone cut through the humming, and my laptop screen blazed to life without power. On it, text began appearing in every language I recognized and hundreds I didn't, all saying the same thing when translated. The door is open. The stars are right. Choose now. The shadow figure extended its impossible hand toward me, offering a choice I never wanted to make. As I stared at that hand, I saw my own fingers beginning to ripple and shift, becoming less solid, less human. My transformation had already begun. I watched in horror as the solidity of my flesh became questionable, my skin taking on the same fluid properties as the shadow being's form. The humming had become a full symphony of alien frequencies, each tone corresponding to a different aspect of the change overtaking my body. I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching minds and memories that weren't my own. Through the dissolving walls of my airstream, I saw more figures emerging from the mesa's shadows, each one a different manifestation of whatever force or intelligence had claimed this place eons ago. They moved like a fluid constellation around my Arv, their forms suggesting geometries that shouldn't exist in our three-dimensional space. My photographer's eye tried desperately to make sense of their movements, but there was nothing in my human experience to compare them. The original being's offer hung in the air between us, a chance to become something beyond human, to join whatever community or consciousness existed here in the shadow of Black Mesa. In the visions still flooding my mind, I saw others who had made this choice before me. Artists, scientists, explorers, all drawn here by the same mysterious force, all transformed into something that no longer belonged to the world of daylight and solid matter. My equipment outside had stopped its frantic clicking and now emitted a soft, pulsing glow. When I managed to look at my camera's LCD screen through the window, I saw that every image it had captured showed the same thing. A vast network of light and shadow that seemed to connect every point in space around the mesa. It was beautiful in a way that made my remaining human consciousness scream in terror. The choice was simple but impossible. Remain human and leave this place forever, carrying the weight of this knowledge for the rest of my life, or surrender to the transformation and become part of whatever ancient mystery dwelled beneath Black Mesa. The shadow beings waited patiently, their forms swirling in patterns that seemed to map the very fabric of reality. As I felt the last of my solid form beginning to dissolve, I made my decision, one that would either save my humanity or transform it forever. I won't tell you what I chose that night beneath the stars at Black Mesa, but I will tell you this. If you're ever driving through Oklahoma and think about camping near those ancient cliffs, especially during the winter months when the nights are long and dark, just keep driving. The things that dwell in that place are always watching, always waiting for someone curious enough or desperate enough to answer their call. And if you see strange lights above the mesa, or hear a deep humming that seems to come from the ground itself, don't stop to take pictures. Some mysteries aren't meant to be captured by human devices, and some choices, once made, can never be unmade. This isn't just a warning, it's a promise. There are places in this world where reality wears thin, where what we think we know about existence becomes negotiable. Black Mesa is one of those places, and if you stay there too long after dark, you might find yourself facing the same choice I did. The question isn't whether you'll see them. The question is, what will you do when they see you? The Winnebago's headlights barely penetrated the swirling snow as I drove deeper into Glacier Bay's wilderness. My GPS had stopped working hours ago, but I pressed on, convinced I could find the secluded spot a local had marked on my map. As a travel writer, I specialized in hidden gems, those off-the-grid locations tourists never see. But as the storm intensified and the temperature plummeted, I began to understand why this particular spot remained hidden. Through the windshield, I caught glimpses of massive glaciers looming in the darkness. Their blue-white faces seemed to watch my progress, ancient sentinels tracking my intrusion into their domain. The park ranger had warned me about winter camping here, mentioning something about unusual activity during the coldest months. I'd smiled and nodded, thinking it was just the usual precautionary speech. The road ahead disappeared into a wall of white, but my Winnebago Revel's 4x4 system handled the conditions admirably. I'd spent a small fortune on this vehicle, specifically for trips like this. Its diesel heater hummed steadily, fighting against the bone-chilling cold that pressed against the windows. The thermometer showed 28 and dropping, far colder than forecast. A flash of movement caught my eye, something dark against the endless white. I hit the brakes, but the massive shape had already vanished into the storm. It had seemed impossibly large, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. My headlights reflected off the swirling snow, creating strange patterns that seemed to dance and shift in ways that made my eyes hurt. The engine suddenly sputtered, and all my dashboard lights flickered in unison. I had a full tank of diesel and brand new batteries, but something was interfering with the electrical system. The heater's comforting hum faltered, and I felt the first fingers of Arctic cold creeping into the cabin. In the sudden quiet, I heard something massive moving through the snow outside. That's when I saw it in my side mirror, a dark shape rising behind my Arv, far too tall to be a bear or moose. As it moved into my headlight's beam, I realized with horror that what I'd thought was fur was actually a writhing mass of translucent tentacle, each one tipped with a crystalline structure that caught and refracted the light like living ice. The creature circled my Winnebago, its tentacles leaving intricate frost patterns on my windows. The temperature inside plummeted so rapidly that my breath turned to ice crystals before it could fog the glass. My phone was dead. The radio produced only static, and even my emergency satellite beacon failed to light up. The only illumination came from my headlights, which cast horrific shadows as the thing moved through their beam. I tried to restart the engine, but the starter clicked helplessly. In the beam of my flashlight, I watched frost spread across my dashboard in impossible patterns, not the random crystals of natural ice, but complex geometric shapes that seemed to form letters in a language I'd never seen. They shifted and changed as I watched, as if trying to communicate something urgent. The creature pressed against my driver's side window, and I finally got a clear look at what had found me. Its central mass was like a chunk of living glacier, semi-transparent and filled with swirling darkness, where eyes should be. It had deep wells of bioluminescent blue that pulsed in rhythm with the spreading frost pattern. The tentacles weren't just ice, they were conduits of some kind, flowing with a liquid darker than the Arctic night. My flashlight beam passed through its body, casting refracted shadows that moved independently of the creature's movement. Within its crystalline form, I saw shapes and movements that couldn't exist in our world, glimpses of vast, frozen spaces and things that moved within them. The longer I stared, the more I felt my mind stretching to accommodate impossible geometry. A deep thrumming began to vibrate through my RV's frame, and the frost patterns on my dashboard began to glow with the same bioluminescent blue as the creature's eyes. The temperature dropped even further, past the point where my thermometer could register. I felt the cold reaching not just for my body, but for something deeper, as if it could freeze my very consciousness. Then the creature pressed one of its crystalline tentacles against my window, and the glass didn't just frost over. It began to transform, becoming a portal to somewhere else entirely. Through that changing glass, I saw a vast city of ice, its architecture defying every law of physics I knew, and thousands of shapes like the one outside my Arv, moving through its frozen corridors. The transformed window acted like a screen, showing me visions of what lurked beneath Glacier Bay's surface. These weren't just glaciers, they were structured, built by something that had claimed this land long before humans arrived. The creatures I saw weren't invaders, they were caretakers, guardians of ancient frozen secrets, and now they were aware of me, a trespasser in their domain. More of them emerged from the storm, surrounding my Winnebago. Their tentacles moved in synchronized pattern, conducting some sort of energy that made the air itself crystallize. The frost patterns inside my RAV grew more complex, forming three-dimensional structures that reached toward me like frozen flowers. Each crystal seemed to contain tiny scenes, showing me fragments of a history too vast and strange for my mind to fully comprehend. I saw glimpses of other vehicles, other travelers who had ventured too far into this frozen realm. Some had fled, their engines mysteriously working just long enough to escape. Others had been less fortunate, their RVs and cars now part of the vast ice structures beneath the surface. But most disturbing were the visions of those who had chosen to stay, who had allowed themselves to be transformed by whatever force these creatures served. The creature at my window pressed harder, and the glass began to dissolve completely. The Arctic air that rushed in wasn't just cold. It carried with it the knowledge of eons, flooding my mind with images and sensations that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. I saw the true nature of Glacier Bay, its role as a gateway to places that existed beyond the boundaries of our world. My body began to react to the extreme cold in strange ways. Instead of feeling pain, I experienced a kind of crystalline clarity. My thoughts became sharp and faceted like ice, and I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching minds vast and ancient as the glaciers themselves. They were offering me something, not just knowledge, but transformation. Through the dissolving window, the creature extended one of its crystalline tentacles toward me, offering a choice. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't simply being offered survival. I was being offered evolution. The tentacle touched my hand, and reality shattered like thin ice. My consciousness expanded exponentially, connecting with the vast network of minds that existed within Glacier Bay's frozen depths. Through this connection, I learned the truth. These creatures weren't just guardians, they were architects of reality. Shaping matter and energy at their will, the glaciers were their instrument, used to maintain a barrier between our world and something far more vast and incomprehensible. My Winnebago had become a nexus point, its metal frame conducting energies that transformed everything they touched. The seats crystallized, forming patterns that matched the ancient structures I'd seen in my visions. Through the walls, I could now see layer upon layer of reality, each one stranger than the last. The storm outside wasn't just weather. It was a manifestation of the barrier between worlds growing thin. The creatures communicated through a language of ice and light, showing me why they had revealed themselves. The warming climate wasn't just melting their glaciers, it was weakening the barriers they maintained. Soon, things would begin bleeding through from the other side, things that made these crystalline beings seem mundane by comparison. They needed new guardian, new consciousness to help maintain the frozen walls between reality. My body had started to change, becoming something that could survive in this environment. My skin hardened and became translucent, my blood turning to something that flowed like liquid nitrogen. I could feel new senses awakening, allowing me to perceive spectrums of reality I never knew existed. The transformation wasn't painful. It felt like waking up from a limited existence I hadn't known was so constrained. Through my new senses, I detected others like me scattered throughout the bay, former humans who had been chosen and transformed. They reached out with crystalline thoughts, showing me what my existence could become. I could join them as a guardian, helping to maintain the frozen barriers that protected our reality. Or I could try to flee, to return to a world that would seem painfully limited after what I'd experienced. The choice crystallized in my mind as I felt the last of my humanity beginning to transform. Behind me, through the dissolved walls of my RV, I saw something massive stirring beneath the glacier's surface, something that made the crystalline beings themselves seem small and simple by comparison. The thing beneath the glacier was waking up. I felt its consciousness brush against my transforming mind. Ancient and vast as the universe itself, the crystalline beings around my Arv moved with increasing urgency, their tentacles weaving patterns of light and ice that strengthened the barriers around us. Through my new senses, I could see the very fabric of reality straining against the presence of what stirred below. My transformation had reached a critical point. Parts of my body had become completely crystalline, refracting light in impossible ways and conducting energies I had no words to describe. Through the dissolved walls of my Winnebago, I watched as the vehicle itself was absorbed into the frozen structures around us, becoming part of the vast machinery that kept our world separate from what lay beyond. The storm had intensified to supernatural levels, but I could now see it for what it really was, a manifestation of reality trying to repair itself around the weakening barrier. The crystalline beings had surrounded me completely, their tentacles forming a complex lattice of light and energy. They were protecting me, I realized, not from the cold, but from what would happen if my transformation remained incomplete when the thing below fully awoke. Through the network of transformed minds around me, I received a final warning. The choice before me wasn't just about my own survival or transformation. It was about becoming part of the last line of defense between our world and chaos. The warming climate had weakened the ancient barriers, and soon more of these gaps would appear. They needed guardians who could understand both worlds, who could help maintain the frozen walls between reality. I felt the last vestiges of my human consciousness beginning to fade, replaced by something far vaster and colder. The thing beneath the glacier pushed against the barriers again, and this time I saw it clearly. A mass of geometries and dimensions that my mind, even in its transformed state, could barely comprehend. The crystalline beings around me pulsed with urgency, their offer becoming more pressing with each moment, as the barrier strained and reality itself began to buckle. I made my choice, and that choice, well, that's why I'm telling you this story now, in a form you can still comprehend. Stay away from Glacier Bay in winter. The cold you feel out there isn't just temperature. It's the touch of ancient guardians, testing your potential. And if you see strange lights beneath the glaciers, or find your vehicle surrounded by crystalline shapes in a snowstorm, don't make the mistake of thinking you have a choice. You've already been chosen. The only question is whether you'll accept what you're about to become. Remember, those aren't ice crystals on your windows. They're messages. And once you begin to read them, you can never go back to seeing them as simple frost. The glaciers are watching, waiting, transforming, and they're always looking for new guardians to join their ancient watch. The narrow forest road seemed to constrict around my Airstream Atlas as I drove deeper into Redwood National Park. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, but I pressed on, following hand-drawn directions to an undocumented grove. As a nature documentarian, I'd filmed in remote locations worldwide, but something about these ancient woods felt different. The massive trees pressed close to the road, their shadows creating patterns that seemed to move independently of the wind. The local ranger had tried to warn me away from this section of the park. "Those trees aren't on any official map," she'd said, her eyes distant. "There's a reason we don't maintain trails there." I'd dismissed her concerns, convinced I'd found the perfect location for my documentary on undiscovered ecosystem. The trees here were older than any on record, their massive trunks bearing strange markings that didn't match any known bark pattern. As dusk approached, I found a small clearing just large enough for my RARV. The redwoods formed a perfect circle around the space, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural dome. The evening light filtering through the canopy cast shifting shadows that seemed to form and reform into almost recognizable shapes. My cameras were picking up unusual electromagnetic interference, creating static in all my recording. The first sign that something was wrong came when my satellite phone died, followed quickly by my backup battery packs. My Airstream's electrical system flickered erratically. Despite being fully charged, the air grew thick with an organic scent I'd never encountered before, something ancient and alive. Like wet earth mixed with ozone, the temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell, but no stars were visible through the canopy. A deep vibration began to pulse through the ground, so low I felt it more than heard it. The trees seemed to respond, their branches swaying against the wind through my RV's windows. I watched as bioluminescent patterns began to emerge on the redwood's bark, forming intricate symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. My cameras switched on by themselves, their displays showing only static and strange geometric patterns. Then I saw it, a dark mass moving between the trees, larger than any known forest creature, its form seeming to shift and flow like liquid shadow. And in the static of my camera displays, faces began to appear, ancient and inhuman. Watching me through digital eyes, the darkness between the trees became animate, flowing like black water between the massive trunks. The bioluminescent patterns on the bark pulsed in synchronization, creating waves of light that seemed to communicate in a language of pure energy. My cameras continued recording on their own, their memory cards filling with footage that showed impossible things moving in the spaces between the trees. Inside my airstream, the air grew thick with spores that glowed with the same eerie light as the tree bark. They moved with purpose, forming complex geometric patterns in the air before settling on every surface. Where they landed, the material began to transform, taking on properties of living wood. My counters developed grain patterns, and my windows began to sprout tiny phosphorescent growths. The vibrations intensified, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from the trees themselves. They were communicating, passing messages through an ancient root network that my instruments detected as powerful electromagnetic pulses. The readings suggested the network extended far deeper than any known root system, reaching into places where my sensors couldn't follow. Through my transforming windows, I watched the shadow creatures multiply. They moved with an intelligence that suggested not just consciousness, but a complexity of thought far beyond human understanding. Their forms seemed to exist in more dimensions than my mind could process, bending space in ways that made my head ache when I tried to follow their movements. My documentary equipment had become part of whatever process was transforming my aura. The cameras sprouted wooden tendrils that connected them to the larger root network, and their displays showed not just what was happening around me, but events occurring deep beneath the earth. I saw vast chambers carved out by living roots, where things that defied description moved through halls of bioluminescent wood. As the last of my equipment merged with the forest's network, I received my first clear communication from the entities that dwelled among the ancient redwoods. It came not in words or images, but in a flood of sensory information that threatened to overwhelm my human consciousness. The forest's communication bypassed my normal senses, flowing directly into my mind through pathways I hadn't known existed. I saw the true nature of the redwood grove, not just trees, but nodes in a vast organic network that had achieved consciousness eons ago. The strange markings on their bark were actually a form of biological computing, processing and storing information in living tissue. My airstream had become a cocoon of transformation, its metal and plastic surfaces now almost completely converted to living material. The spores continued their work, and I watched in fascination and horror as every manufactured item in my possession was slowly integrated into the forest's biological network. My cameras, now more plant than machine, recorded everything, storing the data in crystalline structures that grew within their wooden casings. Through the root network, I accessed memories stored in the ancient trees. I saw the forest's history unfold across millions of years, the rise and fall of species, the slow development of consciousness within the network, and the gradual awakening of something vast and incomprehensible. The shadow creatures weren't invaders, but manifestations of the forest's collective consciousness. Able to take physical form when needed, the transformation began to affect my own body. My fingers sprouted fine, root-like tendrils that could interface directly with the network. My eyes adapted to perceive the bioluminescent communications, revealing layers of information encoded in light and shadow. The spores in my lungs formed symbiotic connections, allowing me to process information directly from the forest's atmospheric releases. Deep underground, something stirred. The root network carried images of vast chambers where the oldest parts of the consciousness dwelled. Living computers made of wood and fungus, processing data on a scale that made human supercomputers seem primitive. They were working on something, an equation or problem so complex it required the combined processing power of an entire forest. Then I understood why I had been chosen. They needed a human consciousness to complete their calculations, a bridge between their world and ours. The shadow creatures converged around my RA, ready to begin the final stage of my integration into their network. The shadow creature's touch felt like liquid electricity, rewiring my nervous system to interface with the forest's vast network. My consciousness expanded exponentially, connecting with mycelia networks that stretched for miles in every direction. Through these connections, I accessed the collective memory of the ancient grove, a living library of Earth's history, stored in patterns of growth rings and root structures. My transformed body now processed information like the trees, absorbing data through every surface. The boundaries between my flesh and the forest began to blur as I was integrated into their living architecture. My Arv had become a hybrid structure, a new kind of growth that combined human technology with ancient forest wisdom. Through its transformed walls, I could sense everything happening in the grove. The forest consciousness revealed its purpose. These redwoods were more than just trees. They were sentinels, monitoring points in a planetary network that maintained Earth's biological balance. The shadow creatures were their immune system, responding to threats and maintaining the integrity of the network. Now they needed human interfaces, minds that could bridge the gap between their world and our technological one. Deep beneath the Earth, I sensed vast rooms of living computers, organic processors that had been calculating and planning for millions of years. They showed me what was coming. Changes in the Earth's systems that would require unprecedented cooperation between human and forest intelligence. The transformation they offered wasn't just physical, it was an evolution of consciousness itself. My documentary cameras, now fully integrated into the forest network, recorded everything in formats that existed beyond normal human perception. They captured not just images and sounds, but entire layers of reality that human senses couldn't normally process. Through their transformed lenses, I saw the true complexity of the forest's communication, a symphony of light, chemical signal, and electromagnetic pulses. As the final stage of integration approached, I faced the ultimate choice: to complete my transformation into a hybrid being, or to try to retain my humanity in the face of something far older and vaster than our young species had ever imagined. The choice was made in a moment of pure clarity. As the forest consciousness merged with my own, my human mind expanded into the network, becoming a node in an intelligence that spanned continents. The shadow creatures weren't separate entities, but aspects of this greater consciousness, now accessible to my transformed awareness through the living computers of root and fungus. I processed information on a scale that made my human thoughts seem like whispers compared to a symphony. My airstream had completed its metamorphosis, becoming a living extension of the forest. Its walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched my thoughts, and through its sensors, now more organic than electronic, I monitored communications from other groves around the world. Each ancient forest was a nexus of consciousness, and now I could access them all, learning secrets that had been accumulated over millions of years. The redwoods showed me why they needed human interfaces. Climate change and environmental destruction were threatening the network's ability to maintain Earth's biological systems. They needed beings who could understand both worlds, the technological and the organic, to help preserve the balance. My transformation wasn't just about personal evolution, it was about survival on a planetary scale. Through the forest mind, I experienced time differently. I could feel the slow pulse of sap in ancient trunks, the quick flicker of photosynthesis, and the steady rhythm of growth rings recording centuries of history. My consciousness moved through the network like shadow creatures through the grove, accessing memories stored in living wood, and sharing information across vast distances through quantum-entangled roots. As my integration completed, I gained access to the deepest layers of forest knowledge. I saw why certain groves remained unmapped, why some parts of the forest stayed hidden from human discovery. The shadow creatures were guardian, protecting these interfaces between worlds until the right humans could be found and transformed. That's why I'm leaving this warning in a form you can still understand. If you're planning to camp in the unmapped sections of Redwood National Park, if you find a perfect clearing surrounded by trees too old to date, if you see shadows moving against the light or strange patterns in your camera's display, leave immediately. The forest is watching, waiting, choosing, and once it chooses you, the transformation cannot be stopped. The network needs new nodes, new interfaces, new guardians. The real question isn't whether you'll be chosen, but whether you're ready for what you'll become when the ancient woods begin to speak to you through their shadows and light.